1,000 times rather would I have confessed myself guilty of the crime ascribed to Justine, but I was absent when it was committed, and such a declaration would have been considered as the ravings of a madman, and would not have exculpated her who suffered through me. And finally, 8 chapters in, we have it. We have the ultimate heroic moment when Victor is faced with the consequences of his actions, when he is forced into conflict himself. He bravely ran away, when danger reared its ugly head. He bravely turned his tail and fled. Brave Sir Robin does absolutely nothing. Welcome to Strip Coverlet, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Ford, and we are here for the 8th part in this series, Chapter 8 of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This video will have 3 separate parts: a So What Happened recap of the chapter, a literary criticism section where we talk about all of the literary goings-on in this chapter, Chapter 8 of Frankenstein, and finally a writer's corner where we talk about some of the notes we can take from this chapter as writers ourselves. So, what happened? They spend some time being sad until it is time to go to the courthouse. In her own defense, Justine claims to have been visiting an aunt and was told the boy was missing during her return. But upon her arrival, the gates to Geneva are closed, so she spends the night in a barn. She can't explain the locket. She asks for character witnesses and becomes resigned to her fate. Bravely, Victor just watches. Elizabeth, however, steps up and says she believes Justine is innocent. Her speech is pretty good, but everyone is dismissed, and the next morning it turns out Justine was found guilty. Then she confesses. Then Victor tells us how bad he feels. Just terrible, you know. Justine requested to speak to Elizabeth, who insists Victor go with her. They arrive, and Justine says she's not really guilty. She confessed in hope for absolution, with the added benefit of being a plot conflict. Elizabeth is sure she'll be able to convince others of Justine's innocence. Bravely, Victor is silent. They leave, and in the morning, Justine is executed. Victor, bravely, does nothing. Other than the developing story that Victor is a coward beyond all cowardice, there is not a whole lot of thick literary discussion to be had in this chapter. But in that opening paragraph here, we get this. This is as Victor is what we opened the video with, but it is as Victor is sort of is hearing Justine's predicament. We get this statement from Victor. 1,000 times rather would I have confessed myself guilty of the crime ascribed to Justine, but I was absent when it was committed, and such a declaration would have been considered as the ravings of a madman, and would not have exculpated her who suffered through me. So, the idea here is that Victor is saying, basically, look, they want to accuse this young woman of murder, and that's nonsensical. But up until this point, his plan was, instead, I will object in court. I will tell them that I aggregated people pieces, infused them with living essence, got grossed out and ran away, without ever telling the beast my name, whence it tracked down my family cross-country, hid in the bushes for a night, and then killed the boy. That should do it. It is not, in the end, the actual lunacy of the statement which backs Victor out. Is the fact that he's a coward. is the fact that he could not stand up and say it himself. A little further forward in the chapter, we have this. This is after the judgment has been passed, Victor comes to the realization all judges had rather that 10 innocent should suffer than that one guilty should escape. This is actually the opposite of a justice system. This is a punishment system. The American justice system, and that's the only one I can speak about because that's the only one with which I am familiar, is based on the idea that we would rather 10 guilty people go free than that one innocent person should suffer. That's what a justice system really is, versus a punishment system, versus a retribution system. The idea that 10 innocent people should suffer rather than one innocent person go free is reprehensible to our modern senses and sensibilities, but it was not always the case. It was, I would say, so this novel is being published in 1818. I would say that it was only shortly before this novel came out that these sort of feelings on this started to change. You go back to those 1700s, and that was one of the reasons why the American justice system was so revolutionary, was that it was based on the principle that 10 guilty people should go free rather than one innocent person should suffer. But there are parts of the world today where it will be the way you see it in the book as well. But it is interesting to consider the implications of this, the implications of such a strong police state. One of those implications is actually an irony for this novel because those types of police state absolutely stifle innovation. And for all of the sort of metaphors that we can throw on to what the monster is it AI? Is the monster the atomic bomb? Is the monster the advent of fire? Whatever it is that we want to put on it, at the end of the day, it's innovation. The monster has come back to life or has been infused with new life, and what the implications of that are for religiosity are yet to be explored in this novel. But the idea that life could be infused to something is a scientific innovation. So interesting that the idea of police state totalitarianist sort of ethics would creep into this novel when it is when it is at least a dalliance in the exact opposite of that, which allows innovation to take place. The next thing that I want to talk about here is sort of along those lines. Make sure I've got this right. Yeah. Justine shook her head mournfully. I do not fear to die, she said. That pang is past. God raises my weakness and gives me courage to endure the worst. I leave a sad and bitter world, and if you remember me and think of me as one unjustly condemned, I am resigned to the fate awaiting me. Learn from me, dear lady, to submit in patience to the will of heaven. Do we think differently of someone who is martyred versus someone who self-sacrifices? Justine's situation is interesting because it's almost in the middle, but it's almost in the middle only to you and me and Victor. We know the truth of who the killer is. We could throw Elizabeth into that mix a little bit, but I don't think that is quite fair. Elizabeth is taking Justine at her word. To us, Justine is a martyr. She is killed, kind of. She's in a very strange predicament in the story, but in other ways, she is self-sacrificing here, but not fully self-sacrificing. She was going to be found guilty anyway, but she admitted guilt. That is sort of the self-sacrificing thing so that everyone can find peace. But no one's going to find peace. If Justine did not kill the boy, then she must know that the murderer is still out there somewhere. So by admitting guilt, she's just saying, hey, that guy gets to go free. But the question for me remains, do we think differently of someone who is martyred, that is, someone who is killed by authority over something, over injustice, than we do self-sacrifice, which is someone who takes their own life in their hands in order that a tragedy not take place? Does that make any sense? What is the difference there for the lesson taken by the observer, the reader, the viewer, the listener, however it is that you want to imbibe that story? What would strike you more heavily? Martyrdom or self-sacrifice? For me, I think it's self-sacrifice. I think that self-sacrifice is something that weighs more heavily when you are talking about spirit living on, when you were talking about message living on. I think that though self-sacrifice is not always in the name of a thing, it is always at least tertiarily so. You are self-sacrificing the way you see in movies to jump in front of the bus and save a child. Well, that's valuing children, right? That's valuing the next generation. That is valuing the future, right? There are things symbolically that looks like. Versus martyrdom, it's almost always political, right? Martyrdom is religious, sure, but in today's world, it's basically always political. And one could make the argument that even those religious martyrdoms are political in their own way. And the final talking point that I have from this chapter is just one of my favorite talking points whenever it comes up. I gnashed my teeth and ground them together, uttering a groan that came from my inmost soul. Especially when you throw the idea of the soul at the end of that statement. It's impossible to talk about this without channeling the Bible. But one of the things that is interesting to me that I don't know that I ever really go into depth with is the idea. So there was weeping and gnashing of teeth in the Bible. Weeping and gnashing of teeth as souls in the Old Testament entered Gehenna. Gehenna is one of my favorite talking points in all of religion. It is just so interesting to me. It is the primordial idea of hell. What is Gehenna? This is from Wikipedia. The Valley of Hinnom, Gehinnom, or Gehenna, also known as Wadi el Rababa, Valley of Rebab, is a historic valley surrounding Jerusalem from the west and southwest that has acquired various theological connotations, including as a place of divine punishment in Jewish eschatology. The valley surrounds the city of Jerusalem and the adjacent Mount Zion from west and south. It meets and merges with the Kidron Valley and the other principal valley around the old city, near the pool of Siloam. which lies to the southeastern corner of ancient Jerusalem. The northwestern part of the valley is now an urban park. The place is first mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as part of the border between tribes of Judah and Benjamin. During the First Temple period, it was the site of the Tophet, where some kings of Judah had sacrificed their children by fire. Thereafter, it was cursed by the biblical prophet Jeremiah. In later rabbinic literature, Gehenna became associated with divine punishment as the destination of the wicked for the atonement of their sins. The term is different from the more neutral term Sheol, the abode of the dead. The King James Version of the Bible translates both with the Anglo-Saxon word hell. Now, part of the reason this is so interesting to me is that Gehenna, as the article here states, kind of got transcribed as hell in the New Testament. It was a valley around the city. So it was a literal, physical place to a tribe of people at some point where I've read some places that Sheol and Gehenna were both places where people were buried. So there's that. Some places will tell you that Gehenna was sort of also the trash pit. So this tribe of people would go to the valley outside of the city and throw their trash there. And then they would sacrifice children there. And because of all the badness that went on there, it developed into what in the New Testament was transcribed as hell. It is just I think that Jewish culture is interesting because we have such a direct line of the transcriptions of their writings into other beliefs. We have such a direct correlation between their religion and today's religions. I think that it is so interesting that this culture, which was just sort of a backwoods culture, ended up being so influential generations later. It's just interesting to me. Like, you see the meme, oh, well, I think about the Roman Empire every day. But you have to think about the Roman Empire every day. There are things from this culture, ancient Jewish culture, which are in your culture that you don't even think about because they are so inundated. They are so inseparable from what it means to be alive in 2024. It's just interesting to me that these things, the history there, right? So here's a real big question to me about this chapter, about this predicament with Justine. Justine is sort of cast aside, at least her account of things is cast aside, and she is blamed for the murder. After all, she has the locket, it must be her. We are told there are other extenuating circumstances that condemn Justine. There is other evidence that condemns Justine, etc. It is so a couple things here. The idea that the child was murdered with no motive stands out to our minds today. Maybe less so at the time. There was less criminology back in those days. Certainly it hadn't entered the pop culture the way it did post Poe. But here's something that would have been very interesting if you ask me. What if we know the child was dead? What if we knew the child was strangled? What if we knew that the child was strangled with such incredible force that it seems very unlikely a woman could have done it. What if, in this chapter, that was the one bit of circumstantial evidence that seemed to pardon Justine? But instead of recognizing that, the townsfolk, instead of thinking Justine was a murderer, thought she was a witch. That would have, in my opinion, and look, I'm not sitting here saying I am anywhere near the mind that was Mary Shelley, but I think that is a small detail in this chapter which could have added extreme amounts of depth to the story. If the townsfolk here were all so convinced that due to the extreme nature of the child's execution, Justine must be a witch. Of course, she's not a witch. The kid was killed by a monster. So I think that would have been something that would have been very interesting indeed if we had accusations of witchhood in this chapter. The number 2 thing, we have ignominy in this chapter. How many times? At least 3, I believe. The word ignominy. What an ignominious chapter. How many times have you read the word ignominy or ignominious or ignanimous in your life? This is this is a vocab building book. Interesting to note that when they come up, because the English herein is not all that different than ours. But there are words, countenance, ignominy, that we don't use. We don't use very often. So it's just interesting to note words like that when they pop up. There was a couple, either last chapter or the chapter before, that we talked about as well. Here's something else that is interesting for me to note. This is my second time through this novel. I'm not the biggest fan of the book in general. I did not remember the Justine situation at all. Now, it's 1,000% possible that's my fault. Maybe it's not a very memorable part of the novel. One thing that I can promise you is that if this were a Stephen King novel, it would be memorable. We would have gotten the boy's dead body. We would have seen it. We would have seen the wet spot in Justine's pants the moment her neck snaps on the rope as she has relieved herself. We would have seen those things in a Stephen King novel. This is something that is always necessary to think about as a writer. If the story you are reading now were written by someone else, how would that story be different? Because one of the things that it lets us do is develop our own voice. By knowing that Stephen King would have shown us the marks around the boy's neck, Stephen King would have shown us the bloodshot eyes of the boy as he stared up into the rising sun when his father found his body. Stephen King would have shown us Justine dangling slowly, right? All of those things would have been in a Stephen King novel. We don't have them here. They would have been memorable in a Stephen King novel. We don't have them here. What kind of author do you want to be? Do you want to be the kind that mentions these things and you save face as a writer? You don't have to write those nastiest parts. You don't have to put your reader through those things. But at the same time, your reader might not remember them. Stephen King is very good at paint. So you've seen a Stephen King movie. You've seen it, you've seen The Shining, you've seen Carrie, whatever it is. You've seen one of the Stephen King movies. Think in your mind the very strongest scene from that movie, the starkest image from that movie. Guys, it's the same thing in the book. Stephen King wrote books in novel format. So that is something that is interesting to put yourself through a little practice, to put yourself through as you're reading things. And the last thing that I have to say here. Thus spoke my prophetic soul, as, torn by remorse, horror, and despair, I beheld those I loved spend vain sorrow upon the graves of William and Justine, the first hapless victims to my unhallowed arts. Unhallowed arts. What a turn of phrase.